Okay, hi everyone. This is the lecture on chapter 29, which is emotional regulation and mood. So basically, we're focusing on disorders, mood disorders, anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorders in this chapter. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about emotional regulation itself first, and then just some concepts that are related to anxiety and depression. And I should say anxiety disorders and depression. So in terms of emotional regulation, right, what we mean by that is the ability to manage emotional responses to environmental stimuli that you or that people perceive as aversive or negative, right? So if you encounter some sort of aversive stimuli, we need to be able to respond to that in a reasonable way, okay? And so if there's disruption in emotional regulation to some degree, it can lead to an anxiety or a mood disorder, okay? If, like I told you, we're going to focus on a few disorders: depression, anxiety, and bipolar. So if we're talking about depression, it is a pervasive, a debilitating mental illness, and it basically touches on all parts of society. It interferes with, the patient's relationships, with their daily life, with their job, right? And so there's lots and lots of negative impact, or it creates a lot of negative aspects or negativeness, I guess, on functioning and interpersonal relationships, right? So though it, maybe to some people it may not seem like that big of a deal, I guess the point here is that it really is. If we talk about anxiety disorders, or if you want to just mention anxiety itself first before you then say it's an anxiety disorder, anxiety is a normal feeling, right, that help individuals adapt to a perceived challenge or a threat, right? It's the idea that, even if you just think about an exam, right? Having an exam tomorrow may be eliciting some anxiety today, or maybe an hour before the exam, you have a little bit of feelings of anxiety. Okay, that's normal and that's good. And that sort of helps you prepare for that challenge, taking that exam. However, if that apprehension or that fear becomes sustained, it can then lead to avoidance patterns and then lead to an anxiety disorder. Okay. And so if you're talking about avoidance of social situations, it's then going to lead to, limit social interactions and relationships because you're constantly avoiding those situations. Okay. If we particularly talk about bipolar disorders, these are disorders that are characterized by manic, hypomanic, and depressive episodes. And we'll talk a little bit about those towards the end of the lecture. In terms of the pathophysiology of depression, a little bit about this, because we're actually going to, pretty much we're focusing on this through the chapter. So I guess the take home message here is that when you think about depression, it's going to involve alterations in neurotransmitters, right? Neurotransmitter levels, and some of the intracellular mechanisms that are involved in regulating those neurotransmitters, right? And some of the pathophysiology, or the underlying, I guess, cellular pathophysiology, can actually alter gene expression, okay? It also involves the stress response system. So the HPA axis and particularly cortisol have been connected or linked to depression, okay? And so that's kind of where that's going. If we think about anxiety or anxiety disorders, I think you kind of have the tendency to think more about sympathetic nervous system activation, right? So if you think about just the sort of immediate response to some sort of fearful stimuli, right, that fight or flight response that we talked about in an earlier chapter, in our chapter on stress, okay? So again, thinking about in anxiety disorders, those types of sort of symptoms, or okay, so let's just kind of I guess we kind of want to associate anxiety or anxiety disorders with sympathetic activation, okay? Things like increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. Obviously, there's certain neurotransmitters that are going to be affected in anxiety disorders as well that are connected to, activating sympathetic nervous system. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some concepts that are related to emotional regulation, more more like concepts that are related to anxiety disorders and depression. Okay. The idea is that, it's going to involve multiple body systems. Okay. And also neurotransmitters that are associated with anxiety and depression also will be linked to immunologic responses and inflammation. So for instance, right, stress of sort of any kind, right? There's been studies that have shown that stress of any kind will actually cause an increase in inflammation. And it could be an increase in inflammation in the brain area, but it also could be an increase in inflammation in other parts of the body as well. Okay. And so there's where the sort of connection is with the emotional regulation and body systems. Okay. Because you have this interplay between with the immune system. And so, I mean, I guess this is a little redundant here, so sorry about that. Okay. Here it says the response. So in terms of the sort of response that's sort of generated from, some sort of stimuli that's going to evoke emotion, right? Or in a anxiety disorder, right? If you're going to encounter some sort of, stress, we talked about this in an earlier chapter, you're going to need to develop coping mechanisms to deal with that. Okay. If those coping mechanisms fail, you're then at risk for some sort of dysfunctional emotional response like depression. Okay. And so this will manifest through certain body symptoms, like we just said, increased heart rate, things like that. Okay. And so that's so it's saying that sort of this response is sort of acting like being in this state of stress. Okay. All right. So again, if we look, we talked kind of about most of these things that are depicted on here in terms of you have mood and affect, or things like anxiety, depression, right? All in the center here, and that they are going to be related to all of these things we basically just sort of talked about. Okay. And again, we're going to talk more about this through the chapter. All right. So let's now focus on anxiety. Okay. So let me just put this out there right now. I'm probably going to go through, or I may kind of quickly move through some of these slides. But I think it's worth at least sort of scanning through some of the different brain areas that are involved. Okay. I believe in the textbook, there's probably a decent amount of figures that I'm leaving out. Some figures that kind of show pathways and things like that. So the idea is that I don't need you guys to memorize these things, but again, worth sort of going through different brain areas that are involved in these disease states. Okay. But you're just going to have to kind of, again, remember that you don't have to really go through every single sort of detail. Okay. So like I said, if I sort of am skipping through things quickly, that means you don't have to worry too much about it, right? You just really need to know what I'm telling you. Okay. So there may be some extra information on the slides that maybe I'm not focusing on. So that means when you go to study, don't focus on that stuff. Okay. All right. So again, if we talk about anxiety just as, a definition of anxiety or the feeling of anxiety, it's that state of apprehension that's mixed with fear or worry in response to either a real or a perceived threat. Okay. So again, the feeling of anxiety is a normal emotion. Okay. That happens to all of us. It only becomes pathological when it is occurring repeatedly. Okay. And usually occurring due to a perceived threat and not a real threat, and also occurring often enough that it's going to interfere with your daily activities. Okay. Some of the somatic responses, like we already kind of mentioned, these are increase in sympathetic activity, heart palpitations, sweating, rapid breathing, nausea. These all can be somatic responses that can occur as a result of anxiety. Okay. All right. In terms of different anxiety disorders, okay, we should know these, all right? So generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, is characterized by just a state of excessive worry. And this state of excessive worry is kind of just like it says, it's generalized. It's kind of about everything. It interferes with daily function, okay? Then you can kind of be a little more specific here and talk about social anxiety disorder, or SAD, where the feelings of fear, right, fear response really results from a feeling of being judged when you're in social situations. Okay. So you're going to avoid any sort of social situation because of that fear of being judged. Obviously, this leads to a significant impairment of daily functioning because you're probably going to encounter people at work. You're probably going to encounter, people at school. So it's going to interfere with daily life. If we talk about panic disorder, this is going to be characterized by sort of episodes, right? These panic episodes or panic attacks, people call them sometimes, where you have these sudden episodes of intense fear. Okay. And usually those episodes are marked by increased sympathetic activity, heart palpitations, right? Increased blood pressure. Those types of things are what you're going to encounter during a panic attack or an episode. Okay. You can break these down into fear-centered anxiety disorders and worry-centered anxiety disorders. And the only reason why I'm breaking them down this way, right, is to point out that potentially the fear-centered anxiety disorders may involve different brain areas than the worry-centered anxiety disorders, okay? So panic disorder and social anxiety disorder are characterized as or categorized as fear-centered anxiety disorders, okay? Whatever, situation that is sort of, or whatever stimuli is sort of evoking that fear response, it basically, that is associated with negative consequences. If you're talking about, whatever it is, whatever has to be for social anxiety disorder, that social situation that you might be in, you are associating that with overwhelmingly negative consequences no matter what, okay? And so really these fear-associated anxiety disorders are really involve limbic structures like the amygdala, okay? When you think of the amygdala, you think of fear, okay? Associate amygdala with fear. When you talk about feelings of fear, feelings of apprehension, they're going to be originated in the amygdala. The amygdala is a limbic structure, okay? And so I guess I want you to understand that and be able to kind of know that, right? That a fear-centered anxiety disorder, or when you think of fear, what brain area should you think of? Amygdala, okay? If you now kind of think about worry-centered anxiety disorders, well, maybe those are going to involve a different pathway. Okay. So it's just saying functional disruption is kind of general here. In neuronal circuitry, the idea is that this is going to involve a different pathway. Okay. So again, we're going to kind of divide them up that way because it's believed that these two categories really involve different brain structures. Okay. All right. In terms of, in general, risk factors, I'll flip to the next slide and talk a little bit more about these risk factors, right? But obviously it can be genetic, familial, and environmental. And like I said, I'll flip to that next slide. It's really just, I guess you call that a Venn diagram of these three risk factors. Actually, let me flip to it and then I'll come back to talk about comorbidities. So, again, this is showing this sort of overlap, right? If you, and this is true of most diseases that we've talked about all semester, right? There's usually a genetic component, there's an environmental component. So obviously there's nothing you can do about that genetic component. And there have been studies that have linked, certain gene variations to anxiety and to depression. Okay. Family here, I think you want to really think about kind of learned behavioral traits from family, right? How do your parents respond to a certain situation is going to influence how the children do. Okay. So it's kind of, this is, like I said, I think this sort of pink circle here is involving learned responses. Environment is going to refer to things like your socioeconomic status, right? I don't know, maybe illness, right? So that's kind of like, I don't know, if we think about kind of, stress or kind of what type of environment do you live in, okay? Is there abuse there? That kind of stuff, okay? If we come back now to comorbidities, the big one, if we're talking about comorbidity of anxiety disorder, it's depression, okay? Depression and anxiety usually occur together, okay? That's a huge comorbidity. There's also comorbidities with panic disorder and also with generalized anxiety disorder. So with panic disorder, oftentimes you'll see the patient also suffering from respiratory disease or vestibular dysfunction, thyroid problems, cardiac disease. Okay. And so again, you can talk about tons of reasons why these might be related. That's definitely beyond the scope of our class, so we're not even going to go there, right? For generalized anxiety disorder, one of the big comorbidities is actually with chronic pain. Also other medically unexplained somatic symptoms, okay? We talk about somatic, we're talking about, kind of in the whole body here. And then also sleep disorders. So I guess the one thing that I want you to kind of think about here is as a clinician, if you have a patient that's complaining of some sort of somatic symptom or they're complaining of chronic pain, which by the way we're going to talk about pain. That's the last, that's in chapter 32. We'll talk about pain. There may not actually be anything that you can directly attribute to that chronic pain. And so it could just be a generalized anxiety disorder that is, sort of the root of the chronic pain, or they work vice versa. But bottom line is it's the idea that you're not going to really be able to see any direct cause for these on physical assessment. And then you might want to think about, well, it might be generalized anxiety disorder, maybe an undiagnosed anxiety disorder. Okay. So that's something that, clinically you think about. Okay. So I mentioned this, right, about genetic vulnerability, okay, that there have been variations in genes that are associated with anxiety and with depression, okay? So for instance, this is giving an example of a variant. So remember we talked about small SNPs, right, small nucleotide polymorphisms, where you have a change in a nucleotide, right? Oh, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Hello, I knew this. The S didn't stand for small. You have a nucleotide change, a genetic mutation, essentially, in a certain gene. Okay, and so one of these is the serotonin transporter gene. So we'll leave it as this gene is going to be involved in regulating levels of serotonin. Okay. One of a large class of antidepressants are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Okay. So they're sort of targeting this transporter. And they are blocking that transporter so that more serotonin is available, to the neurons. Okay. One sort of big concept that we need to talk about is fear and fear conditioning in anxiety. Okay. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip to my next picture, which shows classical conditioning. Okay. Fear conditioning is essentially the same sort of paradigm, right? But instead of some appetitive or positive, stimulus, it's actually going to be something that's negative. Okay, so let's look at this classic conditioning example that we've probably all heard of, and have this in our mind, and then I'll go back and talk about kind of fear conditioning and how that relates to anxiety. Okay, and by the way, there are so many studies, animal studies with fear conditioning, to try to understand anxiety and also mostly anxiety. And then other sorts of related sort of behaviors that you can do in animal models as well to understand depression. Okay. So anyway, if we talk about classical conditioning, okay, so we've all heard of Pavlov's dogs, and so that's what this is representing here. So kind of a couple terms, and I don't know that you guys need to be worried about memorizing, what's the unconditioned stimulus and what's the unconditioned response and what's the conditioned stimulus. That's not the point. Let's just understand the concept here. So in this case, right, the unconditioned stimulus is the food, the smell of the food, right? So it's some sort of sensory stimuli. Okay, in this case, it's smell. It could be sight, right? And the example that's going to be shown here, it's sight. It's the sight of a snake, right? It could be hearing something, right? It could be any sort of sensory stimuli. Anyway, the unconditioned stimulus is the smell of the food. It's going to elicit this unconditioned response, right? It's just this sort of automatic response where the dog is going to salivate, okay, with the smell of food. Now you're going to kind of bring in this neutral stimulus here. So this is the sound of a whistle, okay? Sort of initially this whistle, this neutral stimulus, is not going to elicit any response in the dog, right? But then you're going to condition the dog, and you're going to basically allow that dog to make an association, right? He's going to learn, right? He's going to make an association between the whistle and the smell of the food, right? So every time you feed the dog and you bring the food over, you're going to blow the whistle, okay? So again, and you would have to do that repeatedly, okay? Eventually the dog will learn to pair these two stimuli together, okay? And then what ultimately will happen after you're done with that, now he's made that association, right? He's associated the whistle with the food. And so therefore, when you blow the whistle, he's now going to salivate, okay? Again, before the conditioning, this didn't happen, right? But because now he's made that association, we now call this the conditioned stimulus, okay? Now with fear conditioning, it's not such a nice association, right? Instead of this being food, think of this as being a snake, okay? And because that's the example here, right? The sight of the snake elicits fear, okay? Or maybe it's not the sight of the snake. I guess we can go with this. It's actually that there's a snake bite, right? The snake bites. Even you can go with the dog, I guess. I don't know. The snake bites the person, okay? That elicits, I mean, that's and so no, that's a bad example. Let's go with all right. So anyway, let's sit back. Let's understand this conditioning response. Okay. This classical conditioning example. The idea and what I wanted you to take away from this is that this dog has made this association. Okay. Now we as people can do the same type of association, but with aversive stimuli or bad stimuli, okay? And then pairing it with something else, okay? So let's come back to that. So what the example that the book gives for that, and I think I'm just gonna go with that so that I don't screw up my example again, is an example of a child, right? Climbing over the fence, a neighbor's fence, okay? And basically, you know, he gets into the yard and he encounters this vicious guard dog, okay? So he encounters this vicious guard dog. Obviously, that elicits fear and apprehension, okay? All right. So, and that sort of happened on more than one occasion, okay? And so what then sort of happens, so what has the child done? He's associated the yard with the vicious dog, right? Because that happened a couple times. The dog's there, the dog's in the yard. It elicits this fear response, okay? So what then will happen is even if the dog is not there, right? So again, our example here, even if the food is not there, the yard will elicit this conditioned response, okay? And so for the child, it's that feeling of fear, okay? So there we go. That's the example. And again, fear conditioning is just like classical conditioning, except that it is an aversive stimulus, right? It's something that's negative instead of something being positive, all right? So again, this relates to anxiety just because of what I just told you, right? If you're always just like the child, if every time he sees an empty yard, he's going to be fearful, what might he start doing? Avoiding yards, okay? So in anxiety, people will avoid certain things that will remind them of that fearful stimuli, like the yard, right? Maybe if you're talking about a veteran that was off at war and maybe just a loud noise will remind him of a bomb that he was exposed to. And so that loud noise every time will elicit a fear response, okay? What you ultimately want to happen is that this should get extinguished over time, right? So every time that veteran hears that loud noise, and nothing happens, okay? If he hears a loud noise and nothing happens, there's no bomb, right? Repeatedly, he should now basically extinguish the association between that loud noise and the bomb, right? And then no longer will there be that fear response. However, what happens in anxiety disorders is really this sort of disability to remove that association, okay? And so again, there's these constant triggers of anxiety that again are sort of not warranted, okay? So that's how this all sort of fits into play. So let me just see what I kind of didn't say here. I think I mentioned most of these things here, but maybe I didn't then link some of the brain regions. But so classic fear conditioning and anxiety, the fear response becomes more generalized. So again, generalizing the sound of a bomb to any loud noise, okay? And then you can keep kind of generalizing it more and more until like so many things are eliciting a fear response, all right? So it's this overgeneralization and this sort of inability to extinguish the association as well. Okay, so what's going to be responsible for kind of making and consolidating these memories and kind of making these associations? It's really it's the amygdala. We said the amygdala is involved in fear, okay? And it's also involved in kind of making these long-term memories. So that's the idea of sort of consolidating something. You can also have something called reconsolidation, where there's an older memory that becomes activated, right? By whatever, some sort of stimuli, okay? And then it again gets consolidated and reinforced. And so then that even forms a stronger fear memory, okay? So that's kind of with that example of the child in the yard and the dog. If it happens repeatedly, you're sort of getting this reconsolidation and this strengthening of that association, okay? So it's believed that if we can kind of develop medications to sort of disrupt this process, it might be really helpful in treating anxiety. So what we'll kind of have to now talk about is sort of what neural structures or what brain regions are involved in this, okay? And that can help understand the pathophysiology of anxiety. So one of them, like I said, is the amygdala, okay? And we're going to talk about others along the way here, but some are mentioned here. So there's another picture with the snake, okay? So we're going to talk about that. So showing here the conditioned stimulus, right? This conditioned stimulus being this snake, okay? That incoming stimulus, now this is going to be a visual stimulus, right? Is going to be sent to the thalamus, essentially. So any incoming sensory stimuli that it's going to come into the brain is going to go into the thalamus first. The thalamus is like a relay station. It will then send that information wherever it needs to go. Now, kind of two different things can happen here when you're talking about this sort of visual stimulus that might elicit fear, right? It could go directly to the amygdala, okay? If it goes directly to the amygdala, it's going to elicit a fear response. So there's really no other conscious thought. It's going right to the amygdala. I'm scared, right? This feeling of apprehension, maybe then it leads to, your heart beating really fast, okay? Because the amygdala has connections with brain regions that are going to control sympathetic activity. It can also then activate the hypothalamus to maybe activate the HPA axis and sort of further increase sympathetic activity as well, okay? So that's where kind of that response is coming from. What also could happen is a more indirect response, right? Where this information is not going to go to the amygdala directly, but it'll go to the visual cortex. It'll go to other cortical areas, other areas of the brain where more processing can occur, right? To kind of think about, all right, is it really a threat, right? And so the idea is, well, all right, so now you have this chance to kind of say, is it really a threat or not? Okay. And if the answer is yes, it's really a threat, then yes, then the information goes to the amygdala and it elicits that fear response. Okay. But if it's not, then it doesn't. Okay. So the idea is this gives a chance. And so obviously, if you think about this, kind of what's the healthier way of sort of assessing the stimuli, it's this route. Okay. And so again, if we think about anxiety disorders, maybe it's kind of always this route that's taken, right? And this sort of assessment of what's going on and the assessment of the situation is not happening, okay? And so that's another big thing in anxiety disorders. You're not really paying attention to other cues that are around to tell you it's not a threat. You're only just it's just this automatic sort of response. All right. So another kind of idea in understanding how anxiety disorders develop. I think we already kind of talked about most of these things, right? But conditioned response, the feeling that's generated by the sight of the snake in this case, right? So you see the snake, it's that feeling of that fear, okay? If we, again, I think I mentioned this, but in anxiety disorders, what also happens is that you lose this ability to extinguish this association, right? So what happens in extinction, so you want extinction to be able to occur, the conditioned stimulus no longer elicits fear, right? Because there's new non-threatening associations that's been made, right? So if you're talking about that snake, maybe one time you saw it bite somebody or it bit you. Well, now you saw the snake, or I don't know, maybe it's a pet snake or somebody's pet snake or something like that. Maybe you've encountered that pet snake many other times and nobody got bit. The snake was fine. And so eventually you'll extinguish that sort of fearful response when seeing the snake, okay? But again, in anxiety disorders, that extinction sometimes never actually happens, okay? Or you need to use some type of therapy to get that extinction to occur, okay? Also to just bring up another brain region here, hippocampus. This is also involved in fear learning or fear conditioning. If it's damaged, it can lead to deficits in forming memories, particularly emotional memories as well. So we said the amygdala is involved in fear and sort of, emotional memories, but the hippocampus is really I more think about the amygdala as being the fear part, the emotion part, the amygdala as being helping with with the memory part of it. Okay. So issues with the hippocampus have been linked to anxiety and also have been linked to depression. Okay. So it's another limbic structure. It is involved in the formation of new memories. It's involved in emotional memory. It's closely associated with the amygdala. Okay. All right. So I think I did that okay. So again, I thought it was important to really go through that. And again, that might have been something that you've gone through in psychology maybe, but to really understand that really is something that's really important in anxiety, understanding anxiety and anxiety disorders. All right. Now, there are other brain regions that are involved in anxiety, and that's what these next few slides do here. I think I really just want you guys to just know what brain areas are involved, okay? Like I said, I may kind of quickly move through these slides, but that's just because I don't want you to focus on them too much because I think it then becomes overwhelming, okay? Prefrontal cortex is an area that's involved in fear learning and extinction. Why? The prefrontal cortex is involved in decision making. Okay. And so that's when remember in this picture where, we showed visual cortex here, you can kind of think of, cortex in general or prefrontal cortex as being involved there where it's going to be the part of the brain that sort of, assesses what's going on. Okay. And helps with decision making. Okay. So you can see how that could be involved in anxiety. If we talk about the striatum, I think we may have mentioned the striatum before, but it's an area that's involved in reward, okay? And so it says here, it drives behavior due to recall of past successful outcomes. So it's the idea that it's going to pair action and reward, okay? So it's going to make associations with positive feelings, right? And the idea that you're going to remember the positive aspect of a situation. Okay, what often happens in anxiety is that instead of paying attention to the positive, you're always focusing on the negative. Okay, and so that's what this is saying here. So it has to do with sort of focus, right? And so if there's some sort of deficit here in the striatum, it creates focus on the negative instead of the positive. Okay. And you may sort of see that if you think about this in social anxiety disorder, instead of thinking about all the positive feelings that occur when you're hanging out with your friends, right? Like you're laughing, you're having a good time, you're always focusing on the negative and that judgment. Okay. So as I said, An example might be in social anxiety disorder. Instead of focusing on the positive feelings that are going to be elicited by hanging out with your friends, you're going to focus on the negative. Well, somebody might judge me, or somebody might say this to me, instead of the positives. Okay. And so we call this negative information processing bias. And the idea is that this may occur because there's some dysfunction in this brain area. Okay. All right. So let's move on here. It says here, neural structures are correlated with neurotransmitters, neurochemicals, and hormones. Yeah. So the brain areas that we're talking about will all, obviously there's neurons there, and those neurons will produce certain neurotransmitters. Okay. So there are certain neurotransmitters that we can associate with anxiety, okay, and anxiety disorders. So one here, it's saying the GABA benzodiazepine receptor system. So GABA in general is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, okay? Benzodiazepines, they're actually natural benzodiazepines that exist. And essentially think of them as binding to the same receptors as GABA, and they're going to be inhibitory as well. Okay. You can also, there are also pharmaceutical drugs that we categorize as benzodiazepines. And again, they're going to have an inhibitory effect. Okay. So that's one area there. So if you think about, anxiety disorders, you might think, well, you probably have a decrease in this, right? There's less inhibition going on than there should be, right? There's more activity when things should be inhibited sometimes. Okay. Another neurotransmitter, glutamate, which is sort of the opposite of GABA. It's excitatory. Okay. It's actually a precursor to GABA, but that we don't have to worry about that. The one reason why I want to particularly mention glutamate here is, remember I talked about extinction. Okay. Extinction is learning too. Okay. So whenever you're going to talk about learning, it involves, if you think about learning, I guess, at the molecular level, right? If you look at those neurons and you look at the neurotransmitters and the receptors and what's happening, okay, it involves the glutamate receptor, okay, this NMDA receptor. And the idea is that you need to have that NMDA receptor and the glutamate levels to be where they should be for extinction to occur, right? For you to be able to learn the new association. Okay, so that's what this is saying here. The new association, right? Remember we talked about this? Forms between the conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. If there is a dysfunction somewhere here with glutamate levels or the NMDA receptor, it's going to be much more difficult to make that new association, right? Think about that as new learning, all right? And so that's this sort of extinction really is the key to cognitive treatments for anxiety, or if you think about cognitive behavioral therapy, okay? It's like you should expose yourself to that stimuli multiple times and know that you're going to be okay when you hear that loud noise, okay? And know that it's not, and learn to make a new positive association, okay? So again, I talked kind of about extinction before. This is just kind of telling you that what's involved on the molecular level in extinction, okay? One of the things is glutamate and this specific receptor, because again, this is a form of new learning. You want to get rid of that old association, and you want to make a new association between that stimulus and a positive, right? The sort of positive association. Okay. All right. Some other neurotransmitters involved, right? The big ones. And when you think about like drugs that are going to treat anxiety, you'll think about some of these neurotransmitters. So norepinephrine, okay? We know that norepinephrine increases when you think about fight or flight, okay? You're going to have an increased release of norepinephrine, right? So the idea is that, well, maybe if you have too much norepinephrine around, that's going to put you at, an increased propensity for an anxiety disorder. Okay. The other thing here is that if you have increased amounts of norepinephrine, it can downregulate something called this autoreceptor. Let's not worry about that. Okay. But, there has also been found to be a relationship between norepinephrine and these benzodiazepine receptors. And again, that norepinephrine can kind of be triggering this sort of loss of inhibition. Okay, so this increased activity, right, and this sort of automatic responses, right, and these feelings of fear that are being developed because there's nothing around to inhibit maybe the activity of the amygdala when it should. Okay, so that's kind of the idea there. Also, serotonin has been linked to anxiety. Obviously, it's a big one linked to depression. We'll talk about it again, but also in anxiety. Okay, so you see decreased serotonin, and the idea is that it actually may interact with some of these brain regions that are involved in the fear circuitry, right, or fear conditioning and things like that. Okay, dopamine. Okay, we talked about dopamine already before too. Again, for anxiety, you see increase in dopamine during stress. Anxiety, there's been studies that have shown impairment in dopamine reward pathways, right? We've talked about dopamine before as being involved in reward. I remember we were just talking about an anxiety disorder perhaps can involve a problem with that sort of reward pathway, okay? And instead of thinking about rewarding properties of a stimuli, you're always thinking about those negative aspects. And so that's going to lead to a phobic response, right? Or this fear response. HPA axis, or right. So that's going to release cortisol. That's a stress response. Also fight or flight. We talked about that a bunch of times as well. Okay. CRH is part of the HPA axis. Right. It then leads to the release of ACTH and then to cortisol. Okay. So increased fight or flight or increased sympathetic activity, increased, I guess, HPA activity have been linked to anxiety as well. All right. Okay. I guess I need to lift this up a little bit. So let me just edit this as I talk about this. So this is just basically showing you, clinical manifestations of anxiety and also a little bit about diagnosis. So I think it's actually a helpful table there. I don't know why it's doing that in blue, but that's okay. Let's just move this up so that we don't have the writing underneath and we can't see what's going on here. Okay. So I'm just going to move that over. There we go. All right. So let's go back to that. So if you talk, right, the different anxiety disorders that we talked about, okay, panic disorder, specific phobia, social anxiety disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. I think we kind of talked a little bit about these already, so I'm not going to read through them, but I think this table is kind of nice to sort of reiterate what are some of the distinguishing features of these different anxiety disorders. Okay, so this is something that I think you guys, you should study, right? We should know the difference between generalized anxiety disorder versus panic disorder, okay, and also social anxiety disorder. And then we just talked about where brain regions involved, right? Some neural processes like fear conditioning and extinction involved in the development of an anxiety disorder, okay? Those can sort of be generalized across kind of anxiety in general. Okay, in terms of treatment, like I said, there's a huge overlap between anxiety and depression, and actually, a lot of times there are antidepressants, right, like SSRIs are actually used to treat anxiety. But why? We just said that they're, serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, these are all neurotransmitters that have been implicated in anxiety, okay? So really all of these drugs are going to, for the most part, increase levels of those neurotransmitters, particularly serotonin and norepinephrine, okay? And I believe there is a slide at the end of the presentation that summarizes some of these and actually in a table form. And so we'll come back to this, but so you can kind of take a quick look here. But, all of these have a slightly different mechanism of action. Okay. So again, SSRIs are going to prevent the reuptake of serotonin so that you have more serotonin available for the neurons. Norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors will do the same thing, but for norepi. Tricyclics are older. They have many, many side effects. They're going to affect both norepinephrine and serotonin. MAOIs will, again, increase serotonin, also dopamine and norepinephrine. Okay, benzodiazepines, like I mentioned, like these are things like Xanax, right? They, in general, will, increase GABA or work on those same receptors so that, they're inhibitory. Okay. But you can develop dependence on those. Also, combination therapy very often is used. So maybe there's a pharmacological drug that's given, but in association with behavioral therapy. Okay. Or there's just behavioral therapy alone. Right? I know for myself, a few years ago, I did do cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, and it was super helpful, right? It just takes more time, okay? And there are, a couple different tools and things that are used in cognitive behavioral therapy. One of them is this idea of extinction that we talked about, okay? All right. So that's what I was just mentioning, right? The cognitive behavioral therapy. And so this exposure therapy is sort of the idea of what I was just talking about with extinction. Okay. You're going to expose yourself to that stimuli that elicits fear in you, right? And you're going to keep exposing yourself to it. And you're going to see that there is no threat, right? And eventually that stimuli will not elicit fear anymore. Okay. Psychoeducation, muscle relaxation, maybe even like you can think about meditation and things like that. Okay. And cognitive approaches for automatic thoughts and schemes. So again, this is something that is usually part of cognitive behavioral therapy as well. Okay. Because again, remember that figure where it shows you the snake and those two different pathways? The automatic thought and the automatic emotional response is not a good thing, right? You need to take a step back and assess the situation. And so you can, train yourself behaviorally to be able to do that. Okay. All right. Now, the next part we're going to talk about is depression. Okay. So that was all anxiety. And I know that was very long-winded. The depression part of this is a little bit shorter just because we kind of already talked about a lot of the brain regions and neurotransmitters that are involved. Okay. All right. So if we talk about depression, what is it sort of characterized by? Persistent feelings of sadness and lack of interest in life. In terms of classifications, right? MDD, major depressive disorder. And this, by the way, all of these are sort of what we're presenting here are sort of based on what is, presented in the DSM. So one or more depressive episodes of 2 weeks or longer over the person's lifetime, that can then be categorized as major depressive disorder. Persistent depressive disorder, or PDD, right? Symptoms of MDD occur more often than not for at least 2 years, okay? There's also something called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, severe PMS, but, I don't know that saying severe PMS does it justice. There's also other symptoms that sort of go along with this that make this more serious, right? Substance or medication-induced depression. And then there's also depression that could be due to another medical disorder. So those are some classifications of depression. Okay, so if you talk about MDD, so it says greater than or equal to 1 depressive episodes of 2 weeks or more, okay? Depressed mood, significantly less interest in activities, changes in weight, insomnia, right? These are all symptoms of depression, okay? Obviously, one of the really, serious symptoms are, or these thoughts of death or suicide can ultimately lead to suicide, right? And so this is one of the main concerns and the main issues with depression and depressive disorder, okay? If you talk about persistent depressive disorder, right, or dysthymia, did I spell that wrong? No, maybe not. Okay, I think I spelled it right. Depressed mood occurring on more days than not for greater than 2 years. Again, in terms of symptoms, right? Increased or decreased appetite, sleeping too much or sleeping too little. Basically, it's some alteration in behavior, okay? That's abnormal for that person. Low self-esteem, difficulty making decisions, feelings of hopelessness. If we talk about premenstrual dysphoric disorder, right? Okay, again, severe form of PMS that results in depression or anxiety. And so you're going to see these symptoms, coinciding with the menstrual cycle. That's the point. But the bottom line is that the symptoms that you see aren't any less serious than what you see in what we talked about before. It's just that the timing is specific to the menstrual cycle, and that's what's going to help diagnose this, okay? Mood swings, right? Irritability, depressed mood, anxiety, lack of interest in usual activities, difficulty concentrating. These are, again, they're all symptoms that you may see in depression in general. It's just about the timing here. If we talk a little bit more about the pathogenesis of depression, again, family history, says symptoms in clusters, comorbid with chronic medical illness. I guess I didn't have I thought I had another diagram like the other one here. But, we just said that there's a huge comorbidity with depression and anxiety, okay? So it's definitely multifactorial, just like everything else we've talked about. In terms of kind of biologically, I guess, or pathophysiologically, what neurotransmitters or kind of what brain regions are involved, norepinephrine, right? We already talked about that in anxiety. Also this orbitofrontal complex, this OFC, which is actually part of the prefrontal cortex in general. Remember, the prefrontal cortex is involved kind of, I said, in decision making, but it's kind of the part of your brain that's sort of your personality, right? Your personality traits are sort of a result of what's going on in that prefrontal cortex. Okay, so you can see how that would be implicated in depression. You talk about specifically about neurotransmitters, right? It says complicated reactions between stress and genetic vulnerability, environmental factors. We already kind of talked about that. It's similar to what we talked about with anxiety, okay? In terms of the neurotransmitters that are involved, monoamines. So again, we talked about these already, right? Serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, okay? If you want to kind of think about, I guess, to try to tease out like a little bit different functions between these, serotonin says regulates obsessions and compulsions. I mean, people really think about serotonin as being this sort of feel-good neurotransmitter, okay? Dopamine is really involved in motivation, pleasure, and reward. And we talked about that when we talked about addiction, okay? So when you think about mechanisms of reward and the neural structures and the neural circuits that are involved in reward, there's a lot of dopamine there, okay? Norepinephrine regulates alertness, energy, okay? So if you wanted to kind of tease out function of these, am I going to ask you about this? No, on the exam. Okay, so you can kind of see how you can have this sort of interplay between these three neurotransmitters, right? And that then will impact mood, emotion, and cognition, and can then lead to depression, right? If levels of these neurotransmitters aren't where they should be, okay? Right, and so again, what it's showing you here is kind of what are some things that norepinephrine is sort of primarily involved in. What about serotonin? Okay. And then again, if you kind of overlap these, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to lead to alterations in mood, alterations in emotion, right? Okay. So specifically when you think about norepinephrine, it says here, it works with dopamine, responsible for interest and energy. We already said that. It's kind of they're involved in sort of providing a sense and hope and purpose in life. And so if you have decreased levels of this, you can see how it can lead to feelings of hopelessness. Okay. Right. So that's what I just said. So deficiency in it will lead to negative emotions. Okay. Now there are many mechanisms that control the levels of norepinephrine, right? So this autoreceptor will, again, it's involved in inhibiting the release of norepinephrine. So it's going to, so if it inhibits the release, normally inhibits the release of it, that means there would be less around, right? So if that's being stimulated, it's going to decrease levels of norepinephrine. The transporter, all of these will. Transporter will bring norepinephrine back into the presynaptic cell. Same thing. If norepinephrine is being taken back up into the presynaptic cell, it decreases levels. There's also an enzyme, MAO, that will break down norepinephrine, right? So you'll see that there are some of the drugs that treat depression, and you kind of saw that on the one slide that I showed you before, will interact with these mechanisms to basically block them, right? Or stop them so that there's more norepinephrine around, okay? All right. If you talk about serotonin depression, right? Again, this is really about, mediating positive mood, optimism, also impulsivity, okay? It's also involved in keeping norepinephrine at appropriate levels. So again, there's a huge interplay between these three neurotransmitters, okay? You really can't, you can talk about them separately, but in actuality, the way that they work in the brain, there's always going to be interplay between them, okay? It says here, originates in the dorsal raphe nuclei in the pons and the upper brainstem. So that's where most of the serotonin producing neurons are. So those neurons produce the serotonin and then they can project to other brain areas, okay? And so that's what this is telling you here. And some of those brain areas that they project to are the hippocampus, the amygdala, okay? And so those are, in general, inhibitory pathways. So if you have less serotonin around, if you look at this, you would then potentially have less inhibition of the amygdala. If you make that amygdala more active, it can lead to negative emotions, right? Okay. And then it says other pathways will control other somatic functions. So that's the idea that this decrease in serotonin really can have a broad effect, okay? And lead to these broad sort of symptoms that you see with depression. If you think about, I think on one of the slides, right, on the symptoms, it said increased appetite or decreased appetite, that you can have effects on appetite with depression. The serotonin pathway to the hypothalamus is thought to be involved in regulating appetite. And so that's why you might see that. The serotonin pathway to the brainstem regulates sleep, okay? Also, serotonin can be involved in pain regulation, okay, body temperature. All right, so it says here, balance and specific receptors are critical in maintaining mood. So balance in the specific receptors and balance in the levels of the neurotransmitter itself, okay? And so that's why we say you have a chemical imbalance, right? So any imbalance in any of these neurotransmitters, right, is what we're referring to when we say a chemical imbalance. And it's going to have a broad impact on a wide variety of functions, okay? All right, I think this is the last neurotransmitter to talk about, is dopamine, okay? So we said, dopamine is really, if you think about it, in general, is involved in reward, right? Those reward pathways. I guess don't worry about this. I'm not going to ask you about stuff like that, so I'm not even going to go there. Depression is categorized by prevalent symptoms. Also, so this is the idea that these additional sort of symptom patterns of sort of melancholy and then psychosis that you sometimes see with some types of depression, it's actually believed that dopamine is particularly linked to these additional symptoms, okay, that you sometimes see. And so if you have a deficiency in dopamine, it can relate to or lead to something called anhedonia. Okay, and so anhedonia is the inability to experience pleasure from what would normally be considered pleasurable events, right? So, I don't know, again, going out with your friends, right? Or, I don't know, eating a really good meal or something like that. Instead of it in eliciting pleasure in somebody with depression, it doesn't, okay? And so it's this sort of inability to sort of experience pleasure. And this is believed to involve this mesolimbic pathway, that reward pathway that we talked about when we were talking about addiction in an earlier chapter. Okay. And again, we talked about stress and the HPA axis being involved in anxiety. Well, it's also linked and involved in depression. Okay. So it says here, primes the body for fight or flight, right? We can think about the stress response. We learned about the stress response already. If you think about the HPA axis, right? CRH or CRF, it's the same thing, right? Release from the hypothalamus, then leads to ACTH being released from the pituitary gland, and then cortisol from the adrenals, okay? And what happens is it's believed that in depression, or there's been studies that have linked high levels of cortisol with depression, right? So the idea is that these patients have increased levels of cortisol because they're lacking a negative feedback mechanism. So they're missing the mechanism that normally turns off this HPA axis, okay? And some of the receptors that are involved in this negative feedback, they're in the pituitary gland, they're in the hypothalamus, but they're also in the hippocampus as well. And in fact, another sort of line of research has showed that depressed patients have smaller hippocampus, okay? And that's sort of, and that will obviously, it'll lead to deficits in learning and memory because we said the hippocampus is involved in that, but it also can lead to issues with mood and emotion because of the hippocampus's role in the sort of stress response and also in some of the things that we've been talking about, okay? All right. So here are some of the sort of anatomical changes that you see in some particular brain areas. And we've kind of talked about most of these. Okay. So it's not as bad as it seems. There's a couple that we didn't really necessarily talk about already. So it mentions here the frontal cortex. Okay. And so this isn't the prefrontal cortex. This is the frontal cortex. And the frontal cortex these are different parts of the frontal cortex. You guys don't need to know the different parts of the frontal cortex, but some of these parts are involved in focus, right? Ability to focus. So we say in depression, we said sometimes there's a lack of focus, lack of concentration, okay? Parts of the frontal cortex are involved in suppressing emotions. Some are involved in assigning the significance of stimuli, okay? So you can see how these all can be involved in depression and some of the symptoms that we see in depression. The other thing, it mentions here that there's been studies that have shown that glial cells, which are the cells in the brain that basically support neurons, are reduced in depression. And actually, some glial cells will produce something called BDNF, which is a neurotrophic factor that neurons need. So we say glial cells support the neurons. One of the reasons, or one of the ways they do this, is by secreting factors that help them. And so there's been studies that have shown there's a reduction in BDNF in depression, okay? All right, so this kind of, again, you don't need to memorize any of this, but this is just giving you an idea that there can be alterations in the frontal cortex as well. So I think, again, we should sort of appreciate that anxiety and depression are super complex, right? Any mood disorder is, because there are all of these brain regions all, feed into each other. They talk to each other. They work together, okay? So you can't really separate out one brain region. You can't separate out one neurotransmitter even, okay? So again, that's why they're difficult to understand and difficult to treat. Another part of this is actually part of the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, I believe. Maybe not. Maybe it's frontal cortex. This is another part of the frontal cortex. Okay. This is particularly involved, or part of kind of being involved or more involved in the reward process or reward decision making. Okay. And so the reason why we're mentioning this is, again, there have been studies that have shown that this area of the brain is decreased in volume in patients with major depression. Okay. And so again, it indicates that perhaps it is important in the etiology or the pathogenesis of depression. Okay. So, all right. So anyway, yeah. Okay. So anyway, it doesn't even matter, but I believe, I don't want to misspeak, but I believe anterior cingulate cortex is technically frontal cortex and not prefrontal cortex. Okay. So, and again, I'm not going to ask you that, so you don't have to worry about that. Also, striatum, we talked a little bit about striatum. We talked about nucleus accumbens when we talked about addiction. Okay. Substantia nigra. These are also areas that are involved in depression as well. Okay. So there's a pathway, involving some of these brain areas that then connect to the limbic system. Okay, so we talked about the amygdala and the hippocampus being involved in emotional memory, right? And associating, stimuli with emotion. Okay, and then basically, creating this sort of memory of that. And so that's kind of where this is coming from. It says here, lack of norepinephrine or just dysfunction of monoamine pathways in these areas here can lead to impaired cognition, fatigue, and apathy. And these are some things that you see in depression. Okay. Again, hippocampus, amygdala, we already talked about this. Okay. And I think you guys can see how these are related to depression. We talked about them more in their relationship to anxiety, but also to depression as well. All right. Again, I told you that there have been studies that have shown, even in humans, right, in postmortem, if you look at postmortem studies of patients with depression, that their hippocampi or hippocampus is actually smaller, okay? And also, again, for amygdala, right, we associate, amygdala really is associated with negative emotions or fear, okay? And so it says function is increased in depression, right? Because again, you're focusing on the negative instead of the positive, okay? It says variation in reported results. Yeah. So there's kind of with both of these, with hippocampus and amygdala, there's, again, I think it's pretty clear that they are implicated in anxiety and depression, for sure. But in terms of kind of what exactly is going on, that's variable. Okay. But there's definitely dysfunction there. But it doesn't always necessarily mean that like it's always an increase in the amygdala. Sometimes decreased activity could also lead to anxiety and depression as well. So basically it's alteration of normal function in these brain areas is going to contribute to depression and also to anxiety as well. Okay. So let's talk about some of the clinical manifestations of depression. Okay. Again, these are all based on the DSM-5. And so if you talk about major depressive episode, that can last for 2 weeks, right? One of two major symptoms of anhedonia. We talked about anhedonia already. And then there's also, and again, this is if you're looking at the DSM-5, there's at least 4 other symptoms that are listed in the DSM-5. Okay. Major depressive disorder, 1 or more instances of major depressive episode. We already said that. Right. We already said this before, without a history of manic, mixed, or hypomanic episodes. Okay. If you talk about persistent depressive disorder, okay? Again, depressed mood most of the day for most days over 2 years and 2 symptoms from the list below. So the way the DSM-5 kind of works is there's sort of categories. And basically you say, all right, does my patient have, how many symptoms from this category does my patient have? And how many symptoms do they have from this category? And then that's going to lead you to a diagnosis. Okay. And so that's kind of what this is referring to here. All right. In terms of chronic depression, major depression is going to last 2 years or longer. No more than, with no more than a 2-month period of remission. Okay. And obviously we talked, I'm sure we've heard of postpartum depression. Okay. And it's believed that may really have to do with, has more to do maybe with hormonal levels, because you get this rapid decline in estrogen sort of following pregnancy. All right. So for treatment, okay, for psychopharmacology, right, we already talked about some of these. I told you that there's an overlap in the treatments that are used between depression and anxiety. So tricyclic antidepressants, like I told you, they're older. They have many side effects, so they're not used that much to treat just depression, okay? The newer drugs are more specific and they have less side effects. And like I said, there is a table that summarizes the mechanism of action of these. So I'll come back to that when we look at that slide. And that's right here, okay? So tricyclics, MAOs, right? MAOIs, they are monoamine oxidase inhibitors, okay? SSRIs, SNRIs, okay? These are all listed here. So these are all classes of drugs that are used to treat depression. And like I said, many of them are also used to treat anxiety as well, okay? So we should be familiar with these, all right? In terms of kind of, how they work. All right. The last part of this is about bipolar disorders. Okay. So they are a group of mood disorders, right? We consider bipolar disorders and mood disorders. They're characterized by manic, hypomanic, and also depressive episodes. And basically you sort of have fluctuations between depression and mania, okay? You can classify them as bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorder. If you want to think about mania, what do we mean by mania? So mania is abnormal and persistently elevated, expansive or irritable mood, increased energy that's present every single day for 1 week or longer, meaning not like good energy, sort of increased energy that's not normal for that patient. Flight of ideas, right? This sort of rapidly changing, fragmented thoughts, sort of irregular kind of pressured speech. And these are often, these can be noticed by people around the patient, okay? Delusions or hallucinations may be present. Let me just fix my typo there because otherwise I will forget. And like I said, oftentimes, these things are noticed by the people around the patient, okay? In the sort of phases of hypomania, sometimes there's really no impairment of function. So feelings of euphoria, there's definitely mood and behavior changes that are noticeable to outsiders, but maybe not to the patient. There's no psychosis here, so this is kind of less extreme, okay? So usually somebody wouldn't seek treatment when they were in this phase, okay, or experiencing hypomania. Like I said, you can also have depressive episodes sort of mixed in here. And so depressive episodes will alternate with mania or hypomania in bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. They're usually present, but they're not always present. Okay, so you don't always have to have those depressive episodes for it to be diagnosed as bipolar. Okay, there's also mixed features that might occur. So it's depressive episodes that will occur with the mania or with the hypomania. Manic or hypomanic episodes occur with depressive episodes. So it's this sort of, like I said, it's sort of mixed together. Okay, so that's what that means. And again, this is kind of based on, again, the DSM-5. So if we talk about rapid cycling, okay, or cyclothymic disorder, okay, greater than 4 depressive and or manic episodes within 12 months for rapid cycling, okay, at least 1 week for manic or hypomanic episodes, 2 weeks for depressive episodes, okay, and so it says here there's a period of remission in between. Okay, so it's kind of this period of remission, and then it's sort of switching to this sort of opposite mood. In cyclothymic disorder, there are recurring episodes of hypomanic symptoms alternating with depression, but it's not significant enough to meet criteria for hypomania or depression. Okay, so it's sort of, or a depressive disorder. And these occur for longer than 2 years. So in terms of kind of pathophysiology or pathogenesis, there's really no definitive cause or specific pathophysiology. And that's true of anxiety and depression, like we talked about as well. In terms of, there's a complex, again, combination of genetic, physiologic, environmental, psychosocial factors that will contribute to the development of bipolar disorder. Okay. It says here too, unusual patterns of inflammation and glial cell activation may contribute. Yeah, we said that even with depression and anxiety, that's true. I mean, I think, and so this is the idea that there could be some of these brain regions that we even talked about before, if there's abnormal amounts of inflammation there, that can disrupt function, okay? There's been studies that have also sort of linked it to mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress, right? So if you think about mitochondrial dysfunction, that means there's a decrease in ATP, and then again, that can lead to oxidative stress and, the formation of reactive oxygen species within the cell. There's been studies that have linked that as well. Okay, in terms of risk factors, stressful life events, and again, genetic factors. Okay, so for clinical manifestations and diagnosis. So again, it says mania diagnosis must occur most of the day or for a week or more, okay? It says less if hospitalization is required. So again, I guess it really depends on kind of the severity of the mania, okay, and what's going on. For type 1, at least 1 manic episode. For type 2, there's at least 1 hypomanic episode, okay? And when you think about children, right, remember we always kind of consider children and older adults as these special populations. You have to really assess them based on their personal baseline, right? You can't really compare them to other children of the same age because they can be at different developmental stages. In terms of treatment here for bipolar, now you're going to see that there's maybe some other, different kinds of drugs. Okay. So now we're going to talk about antipsychotics, right? Not antidepressants. So lithium, super old drug, antipsychotic. It's old, has many side effects. It's generally inhibitory, and it's probably not used that much. I mean, actually, it's still prescribed, but like I said, an older drug, and so only if you have to use it. There are also atypical antipsychotics, which have much lower side effects. So one type, risperidone, will actually block dopamine receptors. Okay, so when you think about psychosis, a lot of times that has to do with an increase in dopamine. Okay, so we talked about anxiety and depression where maybe some of those drugs increase dopamine levels. Well, if you increase dopamine levels too much, it can lead to psychosis. Okay, so antipsychotics, for instance, these atypical antipsychotics will actually block dopamine receptors. Okay, also anticonvulsants or drugs that are used to treat epilepsy, or if you think about benzodiazepines like we talked about before that are going to increase inhibition, those can be used as well. And again, the treatment's going to be tailored based on kind of, are there more manic episodes? Is it more hypomanic, right? And how often those manic episodes are occurring, okay? And if they're psychosis or not, all right? All right, guys, that's it. So that was a very long-winded chapter. And again, I apologize for having so much information, but I think it's helpful to go through. Like I said, I left out a lot of the diagrams for the different brain regions and pathways. I don't expect you guys to memorize that stuff, but again, I just wanted you to have sort of an understanding of the complexity.